The young and the restless spoilers Lily's heart raced as she stood before the imposing doors of the meeting room, every fiber of her being consumed by anticipation and dread. She had long heard Damian speak of Aristotle Dumas, the elusive, powerful figure whose name sent chills down the spine of anyone who dared to mention it. This man was not merely a businessman. He was an empire in himself, an untouchable force whose influence stretched far and wide, casting a shadow over the lives of those who came too close. Lily, ever the ambitious woman, was determined to forge a partnership with Dumas. She believed that aligning herself with him would elevate her career and provide the leverage she needed to navigate the treacherous waters of the corporate world. But the path to this alliance was anything but straightforward. Damian, the intermediary who had promised to facilitate the meeting, had made the process more difficult than she had ever imagined. His cryptic warnings, his odd demands, none of it sat right with her, yet she could not shake the feeling that this was her one chance to break into the highest echelons of power. Despite the constant nagging doubts in the back of her mind, Lily pressed on. She knew the stakes were high, but she was willing to take the risk. Damian had already placed several bizarre conditions in front of her before he would even consider arranging the meeting. The rules were vague, but one thing was clear: to meet Dumas, she would have to prove herself worthy, in ways that went far beyond mere business acumen. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Damian's voice, the same voice that had both reassured and unsettled her during their many conversations. He spoke with his usual calm, yet there was an undercurrent of urgency in his tone. She caught snippets of his phone call, something about ensuring she is prepared, but there was also an unmistakable hint of manipulation lurking beneath his words. Lily couldn't help but feel like a pawn in a game far bigger than she had ever imagined. Every time she moved forward, it felt like she was being pulled deeper into his tangled web, a web that she wasn't sure she could escape from. Damian, though seemingly on her side, had his own reasons for pushing her into this meeting, and those reasons were far from altruistic. Devon had warned her, no, begged her, not to get involved with Damian or anyone connected to him. He had always been the voice of reason in her life, the steadying influence who had kept her grounded through the years. But Lily, ever the determined, driven woman, had ignored his cautions. She knew this was her moment. She could not back down now, no matter how treacherous the road ahead seemed. It was then that fate, or perhaps something darker, intervened. Lily had always been curious about the conversations Damian had with his mysterious contacts. She had assumed they were about business dealings, perhaps negotiations that she had no place in. But today, her curiosity had gotten the better of her, and she couldn't resist the urge to eavesdrop. As Damian spoke on the phone, his voice lowered in intensity, but the words that reached Lily's ears were unmistakable and horrifying. He wasn't arranging a mere meeting with Dumas. No, the conversation took a darker turn. The man on the other end of the line, whose voice was unfamiliar and cold, gave Damian explicit instructions to prepare her for the trap. They weren't discussing a partnership or a collaboration, they were discussing her abduction. Lily's blood ran cold as the full weight of the situation hit her. This was no ordinary business deal. She wasn't just being drawn into a high-stakes corporate merger, she was being used as a pawn in a dangerous game that could cost her everything. Damian wasn't working with her, he was working against her. The trap was already set, and she had unwittingly walked right into it. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but the realization only left her more terrified. Aristotle Dumas did want to meet her, but not for the reasons she had believed. He had his own plans, plans that would use her as a means to an end. She wasn't a potential ally in his eyes, she was a target. And now, the looming question became, how far was she willing to go to achieve her goals? Was her ambition worth the risk of walking into a trap she could no longer avoid? Lily's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to back out before it was too late, but something deep within her, perhaps the same ambition that had driven her this far, pushed her forward. She could not allow herself to be scared off now. If she pulled out, she would lose everything. But if she went through with it, she could emerge victorious, or she could lose her life. She stood there, torn between the fear that gripped her and the hunger for success that had always been a part of her. In the end, Lily knew one thing for certain: she would not be the one to back down. She had come too far, made too many sacrifices, and faced too many obstacles to let fear dictate her future now. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but it was also lined with the promise of power and influence. Lily didn't know what awaited her, but she knew this was a decision she couldn't undo. The die had been cast. She would meet Aristotle Dumas, come what may. And she would do whatever it took to secure her place at the top, even if it meant playing the dangerous game that had been set before her. As she walked toward the door, she could hear the faint echo of Damian's voice in her mind, a reminder that there was no turning back. She could only hope that she was prepared for the nightmare that was about to unfold. Damian was no stranger to manipulation. His mind worked in calculating ways, always a few steps ahead of everyone else, believing that with the right pressure, he could bend anyone to his will. He had been toying with the idea of bringing Holden into the fold, Holden, a person whose loyalty was earned, not easily bought. But he knew, deep down, that convincing Lily to bring him into the team was going to be tricky. Holden was not the type of man to be easily swayed, and Damian could sense that there were strings attached to Lily's every move. She wasn't an open book; in fact, there was a certain level of suspicion surrounding her actions that even Damian couldn't ignore. Holden was a far more pragmatic character. He didn't trust easily, especially not when it came to alliances that could change the game. To him, Lily's involvement with Damian was a risk. Damian could manipulate, scheme, and control things, but could Lily be trusted? Holden wasn't so sure. It wasn't that he doubted her skills or intelligence, he doubted her loyalty. She had been through too much in her life, with her family's intricate web of power and deceit, to know that trust wasn't easily given. Holden didn't want to be dragged into a mess he wasn't sure he could untangle. Despite their mutual interests, Holden wasn't the type to just take someone at their word. He wasn't going to blindly follow Damian's lead without taking every precaution, every possible angle into consideration. And the thought that Damian might try to use Lily as a pawn in his game didn't sit well with him. His gut told him that something wasn't right. He wasn't sure what Damian's true intentions were, but he had seen enough behind closed doors to know that Damian's manipulations were often more complex than they appeared. As Holden weighed the situation, he couldn't help but think about Lily's family, especially Devon. The Winters family had their fair share of problems, but loyalty and trust were values they upheld. If Holden had his way, he would caution Damian to be careful when dealing with Lily. He knew that Devon would likely disapprove of any involvement in a situation where Damian was pulling the strings. Devon had never been one to tolerate ambiguity, especially not when it came to people who didn't belong to their inner circle. Lily's proposal to bring Damian into their fold, without the approval of Devon, would undoubtedly stir the pot. The Winters family didn't easily open their doors to outsiders, and Devon would likely view any attempt to push for such a move as a personal betrayal. It wasn't just about business, it was about trust. And if there was one thing that could fracture the foundation of the Winters family, it was the introduction of an outsider without proper vetting. Devon would certainly raise red flags, treating the idea of bringing someone like Damian in as reckless and, at worst, a dangerous gamble. Lily, however, had a different perspective. To her, distancing herself from Aristotle Dumas and his shadowy dealings would somehow prove Damian wasn't involved in anything unsavory. She thought that by keeping the connection between them thin and veiled, she could still play her cards right, keeping the delicate balance of her ambitions intact. She hoped to prove that while Damian may have been part of a darker undercurrent, he wasn't necessarily part of the problem. The trouble was, she was teetering on the edge of a dangerous line, where her ambition and Damian's influence might intertwine in ways that would prove difficult to separate. Nate Hastings, with his own set of priorities and beliefs, would probably take the opposite stance. Nate, always focused on his family's future and their ability to hold on to power, would likely support the idea of incorporating Damian into the Winters group. His logic was simple. Damian was a man of influence, and aligning themselves with him could potentially strengthen the Winters family's position. Nate had seen the dynamics within the family, and he knew that Devon was often reluctant to embrace the business world's darker corners. But Nate wasn't afraid to take bold risks. He saw the opportunity for them to leverage Damian's resources, connections, and intelligence, believing that such an alliance could secure their family's prosperity for the long term. However, Devon was a harder nut to crack. He had always been cautious and prudent, wary of making deals with people who had too much baggage. The Winters family had enough trouble of their own to deal with, and Devon wasn't interested in complicating things further by involving Damian in their business dealings. His instinct would be to shut down any attempt to bring someone like Damian into the fold, fearing that such a move could bring unwanted attention, or worse, danger, to the family. Lily was in a difficult position, caught between the expectations of her family and her desire to prove her worth to Damian. If she could convince Devon to officially make an offer to Damian, she knew it would solidify her standing in the family. But the road to that approval was not an easy one. She had to navigate the tensions between her ambition, her family's values, and Damian's shadowy influence. She could see the potential for great success, but she also understood the risks. If she failed, if Devon rejected the idea outright, her place within the family might be compromised, and her relationship with Damian would undoubtedly suffer. In the end, the question remained, could Lily and Nate convince Devon to go along with the proposal? Would Devon's loyalty to his family outweigh his reluctance to involve someone like Damian? It was a delicate balance, one that would ultimately determine the fate of the Winters family's future. And with every step Lily took toward Damian, she knew that the stakes were growing higher. The closer she got to achieving her goals, the more the risks would multiply. Would she be able to keep everything under control, or would the family's fragile unity collapse under the weight of her ambition? Time would tell. But as Lily prepared to approach Devon, she could feel the weight of her choices bearing down on her. Every word, every move would be scrutinized. There would be no turning back if she pushed too hard.